Welcome to Tabletop Tommies. I'm Johnny.
And I'm Phil.
And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about running a tournament under V3. We've just had the English Open at Warfare, and we're going to be going through what we think is potentially a good way to run a tournament for V3 based on our experiences off of that. So, jumping in, what's the first thing, if you're a new TO, Phil, or even an experienced TO under V2, what's the first thing we should be thinking about now that V3's launched?
So for me, Johnny, it's about what kind of event do you want to run? And we obviously discussed that when we were putting together ideas for the English Open before we wrote the pack. Because once you know what kind of event you run, everything follows from that in the sense of how you structure your pack, what limitations you do put in or don't put in, what kind of year or theme you go for, and that sort of stuff. So, start from the beginning. What do I want to provide for my players and competitors?
Yeah, absolutely. What was interesting is we were going for very much in the style of the Welsh Open, a very thematic sort of, like everyone's still playing to win, but you're doing it with thematic forces. And in V2, that was nice and easy with theatre selectors. Now V3 hasn't got theatre selectors. We had to be a little bit more creative, really, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. So, I mean, we sort of used the phrase historically plausible, and essentially the way we put together the pack was pick a nation, pick a year, pick a front, and build
That's
to
a classic,
to
yeah.
that. Yeah. And I said to players if they were maybe weren't too sure, was like, have a look at the V2 theatre selectors just to give you an idea of the sort of units that would have been appropriate, but you need to build it to a V3 structure. So, it wasn't a single artillery piece, a single, tank, a single armored car, because that doesn't fit with V3. But let's say you want to play, Germany, Eastern Front, 1942. Well, have a look at some of the V2 theatre selectors. If history isn't your strongest point, get an idea of the units that you could take and then build a list relevant to that. But yeah, historically plausible is the phrase that I'd like to use in that sense.
Yeah. And I think using the old theatre selectors gives those old books a little bit more life as well, because it is a nice cheat sheet for just what was plausibly there, as you say. And so I quite like that as an idea as well.
Yeah, and I absolutely used them when I was doing the list checking. If I wasn't exactly sure, if there's some units where I was like, really? Okay, let's go and have a look. I would just jump back into the old books and have a look. And if it was there, because it met, the guidance in the pack, I was like, yep, cool, off you go. So,
Yeah. And I guess we'll talk about lists later as its
Mhm.
own section. But generally, all the lists that we saw were plausible and nothing was absurd as far as I can recall.
Absolutely, yeah. There, any list that did get queried, or maybe there was a request to change, it was things like, you put Panzerfaust and Panzerschrecks in, but you've got, early war tanks. That's an obvious one. So yeah, on the whole, there's probably 5 or 6 which were queried, and there was very subtle changes. Nobody really had to go back and start from scratch. And it was more about, it's like those edge cases in terms of when was a Nebelwerfer around? Was it in North Africa or not? Was there a crossover? Yeah, there's a finish list. Was there a crossover between some of the early machine gun tanks and Panzerschrecks and Panzerfaust? So, and to be fair, the reason why I wanted to put that in terms of pick a nation, pick a front, pick a year, was to either to allow players to kind of theme it, or to encourage people to think about things in a slightly more historical way, as opposed to just having this blank canvas where you can go pick whatever you want from the V3 rulebook and the Mind the Nation PDFs. I've said it many times and I'll say it again. I much prefer playing a more themed list. There's a time and a place for the no restrictions, off you go. But for us, the English Open, like you said earlier, was very much similar to the Welsh Open, and therefore similar to a V2 theatre selector style event.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that I found interesting was when we got V3, and obviously we haven't got the army books yet, there was a lot of talk about it being very vanilla very early on until
Mhm.
we get the army books. But it didn't feel super vanilla to me. Like it felt like a lot of variation in the army still, even though we haven't got the masses of units we used to have.
Yeah, I think there's flexibility within the rulebook units and the Mind the Nation PDFs. Like, there's not a large number of units, but because you can customize, and that's a space issue. Warlord have said that they've shrunk down the amount of pages that the army lists cover, but within each unit's option, you've got the customization there. Without spoiling later on in terms of the list, no, there weren't too many sort of similar lists and similar themes. We had a big variety of nations and a big variety of years, as well as early, mid, late, but also specific years being
Yeah,
covered as well.
and I think what we've lost in the unit choice range, we've gained in the composition range,
Mhm.
because you can now run armies with lots of tanks, armies with no tanks, armies with lots
Yeah,
of infantry, armies with no infantry, without having to necessarily sort of bulk up on the same units. And so you can really lean in one direction or the other, which I
yeah,
think is probably what helped it to feel less vanilla and more sort of
yeah.
diverse.
Yeah, and we definitely saw that. We saw some lists with absolutely no armored vehicles at all. We saw other lists, with with so many armored vehicles. We saw some lists which were very much HE, but they were static gun lines or camping lists kind of thing. We saw others that were very mobile, jumping out of transports and so on. So there was a real huge variety across all the lists. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting that we didn't think it would be an issue, so we didn't put it in, and
Mm,
it wasn't an issue. But I've seen other tournaments doing recently, since V3 has been released, is a platoon limit. And now I didn't think we would need it, because now the officer tax is an
mm,
officer and two squads tax.
hmm
If you try to bulk out on 15 tanks,
mm.
you're spending like at least 300 points on infantry.
In
And
order to take
in
multiples of another platoon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I personally, like, I thought before the tournament we don't need a platoon limit, and I still think you probably don't need a platoon limit, because that rifle platoon criteria makes it very restrictive already.
Yeah, I haven't, analyzed it in massive detail, but from memory, I don't think anybody had more than five, and the majority of people had four or fewer platoons. And that figure of four is something that we're seeing in packs quite a bit, where people are maybe restricting it to four platoons. Um,
Yeah, and I like keeping it open, because if
mm,
someone does want to run 10 like rubbish platoons with
yeah,
just chaff in them,
yeah,
they're not going to win any games. And I mean, the thing we did do, which sort of puts a little bit of a cap on this, is a dice limit.
mm,
And we didn't do that. I mean, from my perspective, the reason for that was time, not because of
mm,
competitiveness. I don't know.
yeah,
Was
yeah,
that
yeah.
your thinking as well?
100%, yeah. So it was a 24 dice limit. I don't think anybody got to 24. There were some 23s and
Mm,
22s. And ignore the Gumby list. I think the lowest other than that was about 13 or so. So there was a fairly decent spread, but yeah, and you certainly weren't seeing, 20 plus lists with 20 plus dice. It was a handful. So
yeah. And in
yeah.
terms of points, 1,200 is what we went for.
Yeah.
It does seem to be the way we're drifting. We're drifting away from the 1,000 up to higher numbers.
Yeah.
I'm not sure myself where I say. I think I do see the lower numbers are going to become problematic if you're trying to put a big tank in. As soon as you put that big tank in and you're having to take lots of other stuff,
Mm.
like
Yeah.
maybe we are going to see these bigger limits. I don't know. From my perspective, 2.5 hours, 1,200. Most people seem to get through the game,
Yeah.
and it seemed about right for getting the toys you want without anything becoming excessive. I don't know. Where did you set on the points? Do you think up, down, or we're
I
already
quite
in the
liked it.
Goldilocks?
Yeah, no, because it wasn't 1,100, it wasn't 1,250, it wasn't 1,000, and yeah, those are three figures that we see quite a lot. So you
Hmm.
couldn't just take a list that you'd previously run in V3. You did have to think about it, and it isn't just about I've got 100 points more. If I've built an 1,100 point list, I've got 100 points more because something. This is slightly off topic, but something I found in V3, it's actually quite difficult to to hit exactly onto the 1,100, 1,250, etc.
Mm.
You're often quite short because there's not a huge amount of like 2 point upgrades or 3 point upgrades, you know. So
Even just the 50 point. So, what I found for World Open War as well
mhm,
was you'd get to sort of within 100 points of the limit, and if you've filled most of your platoons already slots,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
then what are you
yeah,
going to do? Because once you've paid your officer, then that's not 100 points anymore. And so
yeah.
I actually found that myself, where sometimes the list would just stack together beautifully like Tetris, and other times
Mm,
it would be a nightmare, like where you've left a gap all the way up.
yeah. But yeah, I thought 1,200 was good. One thing I will say is if you restrict the dice count but have a high points number, you're either going to be encouraging, bigger tanks or veteran units or something like that. And then equally, if you have low dice count, no dice count, but low numbers, because it's difficult to get units that you might want into 1,000 points. That could potentially encourage people to min max. So you've got your very basic rifle platoon, officer, and two inexperienced squads, if you can take them, in order to get your heavy weapons, armored artillery platoon, engineers, whatever it is. So yeah, I think there's a bit of, it goes back to what I said at the start. What kind of event do you want to run as a TO? Because that will start to naturally dictate where you theme it, how you comp it with regards to dice count, for example, number of platoons, and so on.
Yeah, and I thought, because a bit like with World Open War, my interest was in what people are doing with V3. I felt similar with this one that we were running, where I didn't want to put too many restrictions on list building because I wanted to see what ideas people were bringing. And so I was thinking, like, the thought process I think we both had was, like, the restrictions are there for the sake of sort of logistics, making sure the games happen and are smooth, rather than for any sort of, like, capping the spam or anything.
Yeah.
And I actually think, credit to V3, I think it's fairly well balanced. Like, it's quite hard to min-max in a way that's absurd and gives you a huge advantage over your opponent most of the time.
Certainly over 5 games. You can have the mismatch over one
true.
game. You might even get a mismatch over 3 games, if you're running a one-day event, for example. But I think over 5 games, if you think about what missions you're playing, so what missions as a TO you're putting in place, I think it's possible, to not allow one runaway list to take it.
Yeah, and then the only restriction we did put in for the sake of sort of competition to stop it getting absurd was the one unit that I thought, when we were playtesting in sort of early days of V3, the one unit was the multi-launchers, I thought was still overpowered. We rewrote the pack, and then an FAQ was released, so sort of our FAQ got FAQ'd. And I don't know, I felt, because basically we changed it to a light howitzer effectively, so 30-inch range, 2-inch template, which I thought was a lovely compromise, kept it in the universal rules, but sufficiently nerfed it that it wasn't sort of like wiping squads every time. And then we got the additional pins, the D3 pins, and the one that I think for me made me to a tipping point where I thought, actually, we've gone too far here, was when they couldn't use the spotters anymore. Then I thought, I actually think maybe we went too far with the multi-launchers.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a sweet spot in between. I don't know, what was your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we did it before. We did it before the FAQ, didn't we? I think
we did it before the spotter FAQ. Like, the thing was, there was a whisper on the breeze, I would say, of what changes were coming, but there was nothing confirmed when we sort of sat down and made this decision. And it felt like a nice decision, because I think the problem for me when I was testing sort of 3 multi-launcher lists was because you couldn't rush them because of the 12-inch minimum. That was the thing that gave them all that power. And so making them light howitzers was the nice compromise for me, where you still got a little bit of an edge. But then once you take the spotters off, they went a little bit too far down for me.
Yeah, and we didn't see a huge number at all, in terms of lists at the English Open. And those that did take them, with respect to them, they weren't, finishing higher up the table. So it wasn't like it was being dominated by people with multi-launches who were also winning all their games.
Yeah, and it's such a cheap unit that I don't think it made a huge difference. If you brought one and it turned out to be slightly worse than you expected, it's not like half your army was, because the ones that I saw, I think there's a few lists with sort of 1 in. I don't think anyone brought more than 1.
No, maybe 2 at the most, but certainly not, a whole, you didn't see 4 in an entire artillery platoon, for example.
Yeah. And so I think perhaps the changes keep the minimum range, but the bigger template as written. That might be my long-term sort of house rule to try out, but we've got a year until Warfare again, so we might get another FAQ before then, equally.
Yeah. Apparently, possibly in January, apparently. So.
Oh, is that what they're doing now?
Well, that's what the jungle
is
drums
that
are saying.
Because that's when Armies of Germany's
coming out. Germany's coming out, yeah.
They're expecting an immediate errata. I hope not. I hope. I mean, it is hard. It is difficult. You do all your proofreading, but then, unless you've got people, gamers proofreading, or proofreaders gaming necessarily, like, there always will be a few points costs or like special rules that don't quite
Yeah.
match up to how it was intended to be written, I guess.
Yeah, it's different skill sets, isn't it? Proofreading, copywriting, editing, and playtesting, they're all different things. So.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think we've covered what really we should be thinking about for packs.
Mm.
Now, with all the rules changes, the types of tables we're seeing is an interesting thing. There's a lot of people just running their V2 tables. There's a lot of people who have strong opinions about what a V3 table looks like. Then I imagine there's the people in the middle who are neither they're neither running their V2 table, nor do they have a special preference for V3. They're just sort of seeing what works. Do you have strong feelings about tables for V3?
So we talked about this in our V3 episode, and one of the things that came up when we were playing the game, with the advanced copy, was we were certainly finding that the density needed to be increased from V2 in order to avoid big areas of open ground where you're not going to go into them because you're just going to get chewed up if you're squishy infantry, for example. So in order to encourage movement, in order to not to encourage people just to sit in cover shooting out, we were arguing that the density needs to be improved. I know, for my tables, having played a few games of V3 in the summer, I spent basically September through to the weekend just reviewing the tables I was bringing to the English Open and adding bits and pieces, not huge amounts, but just enough just to break it up, or rearranging the tables so they were in a different structure, and maybe putting those open areas, in other positions rather than in the center of the board, for example. So, and to be fair, the people that brought tables for us as well, I did have a conversation with them prior to the event and just said, have a think about your tables, have a think about the density. We had spare terrain if we needed to bulk out tables. We didn't need to because people brought really good quality tables, but we had those available should we need to.
Yeah, and huge thank you to the people who did bring tables at the weekend.
Yeah,
Really.
massive thank you. We capped the numbers of tickets sold based on the number of tables that we thought we'd be able to provide ourselves and acquire, and some very key people stepped up and brought tables, and we thanked them before, and big thank you to everybody who did at the weekend.
Yeah, because also it's not just a case of the absolute quantity of tables. It's also that there's a minimum quality you want to aim for, because obviously, as you said, we've got loads of terrain that didn't go out. But if that just makes, I don't know, like a forest table with nothing else, it's functional, but it's not that exciting. And so I'd rather sort of have 20 good tables than 40 average to bad tables, if you see what I mean. And so it was really helpful having everyone bring tables along so that we didn't have to stretch stuff out, and it really went nicely. I think, jumping back onto topic though, the interesting thing for me is with the density, it's not just the absolute density, it's line of sight blocking, because I think being in the open is just as deadly as it was in V2, if not, there's a bit of a muchness. Like if you're caught in the open, you're going to get shot. The thing that's interesting I've found is cover is not a Super 6. Cover is not as good as sort of the difficulty of being hit on a Super 6 was in V2. And now that you've got longer ranges on some weapons, being in a forest far away isn't the same difficulty to kill as it was. And so if you've got two forests on opposite sides of the table, having something between them to block that line of sight across the table is more important than anything, really. Sort of just blocking those long lines, because the small teams, especially now, it's so easy to flub one or two cover saves, whereas previously it was so difficult to get 2 6s in a row.
Yeah, and we'll touch on this in terms of missions. It was thinking about the kind of missions you're playing and making sure that certain tables did not favor a particular type of mission.
Yes, absolutely.
Things like envelopment or land grab, where there's movement involved. Yeah, it's a good point about line of sight, because a lot of the heavy weapons have increased in range now. You can reach out and touch from your baseline to to the opponent's baseline. So yeah, certainly thinking about line of sight blocking. It's a good point. It may not just be density equals, it may not be the higher density equals good.
Yeah.
It might just be more about what terrain you've got and how you'll position it on the table.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying about the mission type, because a good table for kill points can be, so say you do just throw everything you own on one table, you can't move an inch without hitting terrain. That's great for kill points, I guess, because you're going to have lots of small skirmishers going and hunting down individual squads. But you get to a movement mission, and if all of your infantry can only move 6 inches a turn, it's going to be a slog, and it's just going to be quite a dull game, really. And so that balance is an interesting one, especially over the 5 games.
Yeah, if you're playing Breakthrough from the rulebook, so kill points don't count, but you're playing on a Stalingrad table, which has just got dense, rough ground everywhere. Very few units are going to be getting into the opponent's deployment zone, let alone off the opponent's edge. So
yeah, should we jump into what missions we did play then, and our thoughts on what missions, what makes a good mission for V3 for a tournament?
What a lovely segue, yeah.
So we did actually play Breakthrough, but that wasn't the first one. We thought we'd start easy, didn't we, with a classic kill points mission.
Yep. So we chose rulebook only missions. We only changed one of them, the last one, very slightly. But we started off with Seek and Destroy, Meet and Engagement, and Long Edge Deployment.
It was Seek and Destroy, Quarters, and Prepared Positions, yeah.
Okay, shows how much attention I was paying. But yeah, we started off with a kill point mission because it was, get everybody into it. For a lot of people, it was their first V3 event as well.
Yeah, and it kept it simple. I thought usually would save this one till the last mission because then everyone's tired. It's not much to think about. But equally, with it being the first V3 tournament for most players, it was let's put it at the front, keep it simple, get everyone warmed up for some of the slightly greater complexity we'll see in the later missions. Decent mission. I think the only reason we did the quarters was just to mix it up so that we had some missions quarters, some long edge. Only 3 draws in that, which shows that people were going for it. In V2, I found quite often at big tournaments, you'd get a lot of draws where people are, you don't want to lose the game. But equally, I wonder if it's because it's the first game as well. People don't mind going for the big win.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So then we played objectives in the second round. This was quite an interesting one. We played objectives with long table edges, meet and engagement style.
Yeah.
And we played it rules as written, didn't we? So it was up to 7 objectives.
Up to 7 objectives, yeah, and sticky objectives as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was interesting. I wasn't sure how sticky would work at a tournament. I quite liked it. I thought the players seemed to enjoy it, and it seemed to work absolutely fine. I don't know, what were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up playing because we had a dropout. No issues at all. It was, I think I had six objectives in my game, but I quite like the sticky ones. It does encourage you, to be fair. Actually, this is worth saying. The old key positions, you basically would be either like rushing on and holding on until turn 6, or you'd be waiting until turn 5, turn 6, and then rushing into contest. With sticky objectives, there is definitely an element of taking the objective early and pushing beyond it. So you're requiring your opponent to come past you to steal back an objective that's behind you. And that's not just in the game at the weekend. I've been finding that in the games I've been playing, since V3 came out.
Absolutely, yeah. And the thing that I found interesting as well, which is a very sort of nuanced quirk of the way it's written, is you capture at the end of your activation, which means that if your range is leading the way, if you lead onto an objective and then run off it onto another one, you haven't captured that first one. And I thought that was a really nice way to write it. And I don't know how intentional that was thinking about Rangers, but I thought if it was written where you just have to touch it and then it's yours, Rangers would be an incredibly powerful force for objectives.
Yeah, and I think similarly for scout squads, forward deployed scout squads, for example, is another one. Because if you want to get them moving, there's a danger that you move them away from the objective because actually they've got units coming towards them and they need to get out of there. So
yeah, and surprisingly, we got sort of 5 draws out of that one, so about a quarter of the games drew, which was more than kill points. But I wonder if it's just sort of like, because I did see a lot of people doing deployment of their objectives where they sort of a row of 3 on each side.
Okay.
And then maybe 1 in the middle if you have 7. People were playing it very balanced, and I wonder if that was one of the reasons we saw quite a few draws, because I didn't see many tables stacking the table in the way that I sometimes do.
Yeah, the old Johnny Curran, method. We're going to stack it and hope we win the roll off. Yeah,
Or if not, I'm going to have to run across
we
the
get out
table.
outflank. Yeah,
Yeah. But I thought a good mission. I thought,
yeah.
can't complain. I wonder if, though, if we'd done that in quarters, if it would have led to less draws because it's less easy to balance the objectives across the table. Because obviously, let's say you do spread them out equally, which you're going to go in the quarter that's got the most in.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a thought for next year, I guess. Then we did do game 3, end of day 1.
Yeah.
We moved into our movement mission, our breakthrough mission, which is exactly as you said. There's no kill points in this. And this is where I thought we'd see a ton of draws. I thought there'd be a lot of people who just played it safe and just played defensively because it doesn't matter how many of my units you kill as long as I stop you getting off.
Yeah. It's I like envelopment. I like the old double envelopment. What I would have liked to have seen, and it was a deliberate decision we didn't do this, is allowing kill points as well. Because the reason why we didn't do it was because we wanted just to keep it straight out of the rule book and really not complicate things. But I like, and we talked about this in previous episodes, I like how you can potentially win a mission in more than one way.
Yeah.
I don't like every mission being about kill points, but certainly for something like breakthrough. And this is probably because the list I was running only had 8 dice, so I was up against it anyway. But I do like I like breakthrough. I like the old double envelopment.
Yeah. Well, what I quite liked about it being in a tournament pack is it forces you not to just bring a gun line, because if you just bring a gun line, one unit slips past you and you've lost the game. And so it encourages players to build a more generic list, sort of a generalist list that can advance and can defend if you can't win on kill points. And so actually,
or people knowingly go, well, do you know what? I'm just going to let that one go. So we put the missions in the pack before the list deadline. So there was one list which is a brilliantly themed list, the Canadian list, the Hasty Peas, which is obviously running as a Great Britain, which was just full of artillery and observers. So absolutely,
and heavy mortars as well,
and heavy mortars, absolutely terrible for a game like or a mission like Envelopment, but what a cool theme. And Mike who took that list was like, okay, that mission's not gonna work for me, but that's fine.
Yeah, and I mean that's fine for most players who go to tournaments. They'll accept that sort of 2 wins, 2 losses, and a draw is a nice result for you. So if that's the one you lose, so que sera. But actually, for the sort of the competitive bunnies who come to win, actually forcing their hand to not just take a kill points list is a nice little quirk of that. Yeah. So we've done our kill points, we've done our objectives, we've done our movement, and so we went for a classic, didn't we? Next, we went for the old sectors.
Yeah, so it was just land grab straight out of the rule book. So quarters deployment, prepared positions, and prep bombardment as well.
Yeah, so nothing that exciting because we were saving all the excitement for the final game. Which, having said you enjoy games where there's multiple ways to win, this has to be the mission for you. So we played the Grand Designs mission. I'm calling it Grand Tactical, as it's called in the rulebook.
Sponsored by Kevin MacLeod, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Where and much like Grand Designs, there's a little bit of everything. All your favorite touches. You can have a little niche over here. You can have something in your nook over here. It's wonderful. So you've got your central objective, strategic one. You've got a briefcase on top with your top secret documents in for you to run off the table with. You've got demolition objectives. You've got up to 7 objectives, and they're all worth different points, as well as running off the table, off your opponent's table edge is worth points, and killing a unit is worth points. And so there's a lot of points to play for. And I was expecting this one to be just carnage. And I was keen for this one to be included. I know you weren't that keen when we first started talking about it, but I was keen because I thought, if we don't do it now, we're never going to do it because people are going to poo-poo this mission for days. And then if you try to do it in 2 years' time and no one's ever done it at a tournament. And so if we want to try it, I thought, carpe diem, this is the time.
Yeah. I think when we first talked about it, I was like, oh, really? But actually, I've really enjoyed it. We did restrict it a little bit. There was only first wave. There was no reserves. There was no outflanking. So there was no, It was basically you've just got to bring on your units on first wave. That did cause one issue with regards to anyone playing against Italians, because you can't run. So we basically said if you're playing against Italians and you've got fixed weapons, they can have a 6-inch move onto the table in turn one. So yeah, the sort of the interaction between the mission, our slight restrictions, and some of the nations that were taken, but we'd seen it in advance. We'd spoken to the players taking those nations, and we made sure that the players on the day knew. Yeah, I actually really enjoyed it because you could win in so many different ways. Yeah, or lose in my case in so many different ways.
Yeah,
So.
exactly. And like no infiltrators was there, so that you couldn't grab the briefcase immediately.
Yeah.
But no reserves was there just because, just to give people one less thing to think about. Just bring your army on and get going, because really the reserves I don't think were going to help you that much, really.
No. And I think, if this was the Welsh nationals or the English nationals and so on, and this was pulled out, we'd be like, really? But actually, something like the English Open, it's a bit of a laugh. It's a bit fun. Yes, people are taking it seriously and they want to win, but it's also quite a good leveler as well, because you can, people know how to play kill points and land grab and envelopment and key positions. Grand Tactical, well, okay, anything could happen, and certainly in a lot of the games, anything did happen. So.
Yeah, and what was interesting is the results were very similar to the other missions. So, like, in terms of the draws, there was 4 draws, and in mission 3 to 5, we had 4 draws in each one. And so Grand Tactical had as many draws as the other ones. In terms of dice killed, it was similar, sort of. I think it was 4.25 dice was the average kills, and sort of in objectives, it was 4.5. Each game were players, it was sort of between 4 and 5 dice people were killing. And so all of the numbers, when I looked at them afterwards, was similar to all of the sort of traditional missions. And other than the sort of immediate sort of setup, maybe sort of overwhelm some players might have faced, it actually seemed to go really well. And there weren't that many queries other than things like, can I run back on the table after I've run off with the briefcase? Which is one thing that I think would need to be clarified for future ones, just because people are going to ask it. We ruled you couldn't, because it's like double envelopment. Running back on the table would be crazy. And things like just clarifying that the mission doesn't end when the base is destroyed. But other than that, everyone just seemed to understand what was happening and play the mission however they want to play it, which I thought was actually a really nice way to end the weekend.
Yeah, it was a good mission in the sense of it was a bit of a laugh. We were all in it together as well. So, yeah.
I mean, there was a bit of a demand on us, because obviously you'd prepared loads of objectives that were double-sided with a colour on each side for objectives anyway.
Sticky objectives, yeah.
Which really took a lot of pressure off the players bringing objectives. This one required sort of 2 bases per table, a strategic objective additionally in the middle, and top secret little briefcase to carry around. So there was a little bit extra, but it wasn't ludicrous to the point that like it felt like a lot of work to do beforehand. No. And I actually do think it has legs as a competitive.
Yeah. I would like to see us do it again next year. Yeah, and unless we get 40 players turning around and going, "Don't do that. It was a rubbish idea, guys."
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be upset if I turn up to Welsh Nationals and game 1 is Grand Tactical.
Okay, Reese, don't get any ideas.
No, please do, Reese. I think it's a good one. I'd certainly rather play it than Kitty Hawk. That's my opinion, because at least, exactly as you say, I like the fact that you can just decide how you play. You could just run off the table and ignore the battle if you wanted, which would be quite fun. Try and catch the briefcase on the route.
Yeah, you've got agency, haven't you, in Grand Tactical? Yeah,
absolutely, and that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Yeah,
brilliant. So I guess we've covered all the things TOs should be thinking about in terms of their pack and sort of designing their tournament. The thing that you have a little bit less control over is what the players actually submit. And so I imagine what would be useful for the competitive players who are just curious what people will bring, but also for TOs who are keeping an eye out for stuff. The type of lists we saw will probably be quite useful. Obviously, we're not going to go through all 40 lists we got submitted, but we'll sort of jump through some of the ones we thought were interesting. And what I might do is, if you're watching on YouTube, I might just run them over the screen, just as we're talking, so you don't have to look at our mugs any longer.
So we had, I mean, just before getting into that, we
Mhm.
had 38 players in the end, because people have asked about this. There were 9 German lists, 6 US, 5 Great Britain, 6 if you count the Canadian one,
Mm,
5 Soviet Union, and then you had Italy, Finland, Japan, partisan. So we had 2 partisan lists. One was a Chinese list, and one was an Operation Geigen Irish list, which was awesome.
yeah, that was good.
We had a French list, we had a Greek list, and we had a Polish list. So, we had the 5 major nations represented, but we had a good spread in terms of the minors. List that caught my eye. So the Polish list, Alex's Polish list, was very thematic, and it was 1939. It was a load of tankettes and a load of lancers. So it was very competitive,
Yeah.
but it was also very thematic. That was really interesting to see, how you could do with that. And Alex did really well over the weekend. He's obviously a very, very good player. So that caught my eye.
It was very cool, that list. I like those lists where you lean into one thing. So that was very much leaning into mobility and rushing across the table. And I thought, that was one that caught my eye as well.
Yeah, I mentioned Mike's Canadian list, with all of the HE and artillery reservers, no vehicles. There were 2 Finnish lists. I played both of them. I really liked Bill Green's Finnish list. It was like 20 or 21 dice, MSU, but he did have like the T28 and the BA10 and the Stug. But he had a lot of small teams. In our game, it didn't quite work for him because what were small teams, which are obviously no longer small teams, they are really squishy. So
Yeah.
whilst he had a lot of dice, it also meant there was a lot of units to kill. The Japanese list was interesting. Obviously, competitive Japanese lists in V2 quite often tended to be a lot of inexperienced guys with or without bamboo sticks or militia. Whereas Ben, who finished second, or this is Ben A, there were 2 Japanese lists, but Ben A, his list was 3 tankettes, and then a lot of HE and a lot of veteran units, so difficult to shift. And the Type 92 tankette, which every opportunity I will bang on about because I do love it, buzzing around, with the HMGs. The list that won, Gary's US list, no armor. He had armored vehicles because he had half tracks and scout cars, and he took an engineer platoon, a man after your own heart. But that was
Absolutely.
interesting. That was veteran rangers and some HE, and then the engineers jumping out of the half tracks and the scout cars.
And he won as well, so barbecue's still on the menu, eh?
Barbecue still on the menu for yourself, yeah.
Yep. To be fair, Gary is a good player, and he's coming off the back of, this is his 3rd win in a row. So he won Warlord GT, Scottish Nationals, and now he's rocked up to the English Open and taken that one as well. So he's very much the man to be stopped at the minute.
Yeah, and we had some really interesting themes. There was an British Expeditionary Force list, which was cool. Early War French. The Greek list was great. I really liked the Chinese partisan list and the Irish Operation Gigant list. There was a Soviet Cossack inspired list, which looked really cool with the dancing Cossacks. And then some of the other lists were, I guess, what you'd expect to see. A German DAC North Africa.
I was going to say DAC was still there in force.
DAC was still there. It's going to have Panzer IIIs. It's going to have anti-tank rifles. It's going to have guys in vehicles. There was a couple of British desert North Africa lists, which are cheap tanks with autocannons and MGs and backed up with HE and 25-pounders. So
yeah, and it's interesting. You had a lot of diversity. No one really lent too hard into sort of tanks or into flamethrowers. I mean, there was one, but he wasn't meant to be there.
No, so I ended up having to jump in. So we had a late dropout on Friday, and I really didn't want to play because it was our first V3 tournament. And I was like, okay, I need to build a list with no notice, which can play quickly. So I ended up taking an 8 dice list, which was the other thing as well was Warlord sent us the Battle of the Bulge starter set, which is great, and I'll do something on that in the future. So I just finished painting up the 24 US riflemen. So I was like, right, I've got 24 guys plus the General Macaulay from the open date. I'd painted him as
Hmm.
well. Can I build a list to 1,200 points based on these 25 people? Turns out I could. So I had General McAuliffe as my platoon commander. I had three veteran airborne stubborn squads, SMG, BAR, and so on. And then I had four tanks. So I had two veteran Shermans. I had a regular Hellcat, which I forgot to put recce on. And I had the
Really?
M60. Yeah, I did. Yeah,
You
and
missed the
actually,
biggest perk of the Hellcat.
yeah, I put the pencil on. I put the HMG pencil on, but forgot the recce, and then I had the M16. So I only had 8 dice, but half of them were armored vehicles. It was
Yeah.
surprisingly resilient, I
Well,
have
I
to say.
think because you did really well, and I think people really
Yeah,
struggled
yeah,
against it because I think there was a bit of a culture shock where people were rocking up
mm.
expecting one thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
They had to face this 8 dice list, which was a bit of a joke list with so few dice, but
yeah,
then
yeah.
didn't really know how to deal with it, basically, by the looks of things.
No, so the first game was kill points. Once I'd taken out the AT assets, I was able to just drive my vehicles around. That was a draw, but I was
Mhm.
1 dice away from winning. The second one was key positions. Bearing in mind, I've only
Which you
got four.
shouldn't have won with
Yeah,
three
yeah.
infantry squads, basically.
I've got 3 infantry squads and a LT, and I took 4 out of 6 objectives and the secondary, which, yeah. The third one in development, I was up against a high dice list, and I just got ran over, which is as you'd expect. Sectors, I went up against 21 dice list and won, basically because I killed 13 dice.
Yeah.
Because they were the small units, and I just drove. The Shermans were, because they're veterans, they're not taking pins. So people who are bringing AT rifles and autocannons, you've got an armor 9 vehicle that is a veteran. Unless you start hitting it in the side or the rear, it's not going to take a pin. And then the final game, I only just lost. I basically needed a saving throw to draw the game on the last dice, and I failed the saving throw. The unit died. It meant I wasn't contesting an objective, and it was a loss. So yeah, I ended up, doing surprisingly well with an 8 dice list that I built at the last minute with the intention of playing quickly. So
Well, yeah, this was that you were supposed to be our last placed,
mm,
easy, quick games,
yeah,
finish sort of half-hour games,
yeah,
get smashed, give someone a nice win, and then have plenty of time to do tournament stuff. You
yeah.
actually played for like most of the time, effectively, and ended up quite high up the table.
Yeah, I think 2 of my games were about an hour and a half, and then the others pretty much went to like the 2.5. And I was like, okay, can we speed it up? And it wasn't because my opponent was was playing slowly. My first game in with Alex, my infantry didn't fire a single shot.
Yeah,
So the kill points came from the 4 vehicles. They just ran my infantry towards the secondary. That was the sole job, not to die, and they did die, and run to the secondary. But yeah,
yeah, and then you ended up 18th on the table, so
yeah,
almost exactly halfway up. So,
yeah.
so there you go. It's not about the number of dice; it's how you use them, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think to be fair, having 2 armor 9 veteran vehicles, it's a lot to deal with. Because if people are expecting armor 8 and they're taking autocannons and AT rifles, I wouldn't recommend it
Yeah,
as
I
a
was going to say is that the new meta is a
it's
double veteran Sherman.
double veteran Shermans. Probably not, but it's certainly got people thinking. And actually, to be fair, I think the 3 games I didn't lose, my opponents were like, I really wasn't expecting that, and it's absolutely made me think about how I would deal with that, or whether there's something there.
Yeah.
There isn't something there. It's 8 dice. It's rubbish.
Well, I think it's if you either want something good, you either want some good AT or some
Mm.
speed. Because as you say, if they'd got round your sides, I don't think you paid to cancel the thin sides, did you? So
No, I just took the basic ones and made them
yeah.
better. Yeah,
And
yeah,
so if you'd really legged it up with your AT rifle, you could
yeah,
start
yeah,
putting pins on and sort of slowing you down.
yeah,
But who knows? It could be the new meta.
yeah.
The other thing I think we really do have to mention is the sponsors. And so if you're running a tournament, do reach out to the companies who might want to sponsor the event. And everyone was incredibly generous. I mean, how many sponsors did we get in the end, Phil?
So we had 6 sponsors for the event itself. So they were in order of rounds. We had Any Scale Models, who make sort of resin models, and they all of our players had a voucher from them. Paint and Glue Miniatures, second round, so they're 3D printing company in the UK. Great Escape Games, who we all know make brilliant metal minis for the Minor Nations. That's where we tend to see them in bolt action. We have Micro Art Studio, who make the lovely pre-painted, pre-printed MDF terrain. Osprey Games, obviously, who are the publisher of the rules, and then the overall sponsor was Warlord Games. So we had 6 sponsors for the event itself, and then in terms of Warfare itself, we had Deep Cut Studios, Warpaint Figures, and Westman Miniatures, who also sponsored the whole competition. So yeah, really good price support. Everybody who got back to us provided us with something. So nobody turned around and said, we'd love to, but we can't. And it was very generous support as well.
Yeah. So a huge thank you to everyone who did sponsor us. So I guess looking forward, I'm looking forward to Beachhead now. That's my big thing next. Then hopefully we'll see the Welsh Nationals, and then we'll see Warlord GT, I guess, in the summer. It's the other big one. But
yeah, we've got the English Nationals as well in April at Roll Call.
Yeah. Yep. And then Scots Nationals in September again. All these, quite a lot of good tournaments going on. So I'm interested to see how V3 develops. I know Beachhead's running quite a generic pack and just sort of limiting platoons and multi-launchers to 2.
Yes,
platoons
to
4, multi-launchers to 2.
Multi-launchers,
which is a slightly different way the way we went. So I'm curious to see how that pans out. But I guess we'll see in the future.
So if you are thinking about running an event and you'd like to bounce some ideas, or you'd like to pick our brains, do reach out to us either on Facebook or send us an email. We're very happy to give you some thoughts and have a look at things. And if you're running an event in the south of England, let us know, because you never know. We may well be free. We may well come along and help out, or come along and play, depending on what you want.
Yeah, but we may talk about it on the podcast, just as a warning there. As ever, thank you for listening. Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.